Welcome to everyone. My name is Meredith Jacobs, and I am the CEO of Jewish Women International. Thank you for joining us today as we share the findings from our National Needs Assessment, raising awareness and understanding of domestic violence in the Jewish community. Deborah Rosenbloom and I were talking yesterday about how, in a way, we cannot believe today is actually here. What we are about to share represents an incredible amount of work during an extraordinary time. And yet this work, as difficult as it was, as hard as the conversations and stories were to hear, sustained us with the thought of the change we can bring once we truly understand the state of the field. I want to express my deep gratitude to the extraordinary lead project team, Deborah Rosenbloom, JWI's Chief Program Officer, Dorian Karp, JWI's Director of Advocacy and Policy, and Rob Valente, who joined us as a consultant and whose deep experience includes serving as the founding director of the American Bar Association's Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. I also want to thank our advisory team, who spent countless hours helping us shape the research and inform the conversations. Susie Feldman, Director of Philanthropy and Corporate Relations at Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit. Dr. Shoshannah Frydman, Executive Director of the Shalom Task Force. Danielle Hartman, President and CEO of the Ruth and Norman Rales Jewish Family Services. Darcy Hirsch, the Washington representative for the Network of Jewish Human Service Agencies. Rabbi David M. Rosenberg, co-chair of JWI's Clergy Task Force on Domestic Abuse in the Jewish Community and coordinator of Jewish Educational Services at JCFS Chicago. And Naomi Tucker, founder and executive director of Shalom Bay Area. I also want to thank the advocates and staff from around the country who filled out the survey and participated in peer forums, and to the survivors who so generously trusted us with their stories. I thank you all for being here, the more than 400 of you who cared enough to spend this hour with us. I know so many of you who are watching are staff and advocates at domestic violence programs, and I want you to know that this report is dedicated to you, to the life you have dedicated to helping survivors rebuild their lives. And it's dedicated to those who survived and those who did not. May their memories be for a blessing. This work would not have been possible without the generous support of Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies. I want to especially thank Stacy Schusterman and Lisa Eisen for their unwavering dedication to gender and reproductive rights. And with that, it is my honor to introduce Lisa Eisen, co-president of Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies.
Thanks, Meredith, and thanks to everyone who's on this call for making time for what I think is really a critical conversation. We at Schusterman Family Philanthropies are proud to have supported JWI this past year as they undertook this national needs assessment of domestic violence in the Jewish community. Last March, as COVID began spreading through our communities, story after story emerged of women quarantining with their abusers, and how stressors connected to the pandemic, whether financial, employment, or otherwise, were increasing the levels of violence and abuse in homes. The conclusion is and was clear. The pandemic has exacerbated issues of domestic violence and abuse that have gone on for just far too long. And the Jewish community is not immune from these same issues in broader society. Domestic violence definitely exists within the Jewish community, and it must be addressed, and survivors must be supported if we're going to live up to our ideals of being an inclusive and welcoming and supportive community for all who want to be part of it. At Schusterman, we have felt a strong sense of urgency to do something. In the Jewish community, we look to JWI, who for decades has worked alongside key partners to address violence against women, be it through the children's libraries they build on domestic violence, in domestic violence shelters, to the high-level trainings they bring to domestic violence advocates and professionals, to federal advocacy, protecting and supporting survivors, and prevention work on college campuses, as well as resources for Jewish clergy and convenings with multi-faith organizations. JWI is really the Jewish community's voice at some of the most critical tables in the domestic violence field. But before advancing the work, we realized we needed to take a critical assessment of the field. What are the needs of the programs and the advocates who work every day to support survivors? And what are the unique needs of Jewish survivors? Are they the same or different during the pandemic? And that brings us to the present. Today, we're going to learn about the report's findings and hear a vision for next steps, how we as a Jewish community can respond in a way that will support survivors and their children on their path to safety. So on behalf of Schusterman Family Philanthropies, I want to thank JWI and especially Meredith and Deborah and the team who worked on this report for their partnership and their strong work. And now I'm pleased to introduce Pryor, a member of JWI's Board of Trustees and a Schusterman Fellow. Rain will be moderating our panel of experts, and at 12:45, we'll open up the conversation for your questions. So please feel free to drop any questions and comments into the chat. Thank you, Rain, and I'm going to turn everything over to you now.
Thank you, Lisa. It's such an honor to be here and to moderate this incredible, important conversation that we're having. I'm so grateful to be a member of the Board of Trustees for JWI, having grown up around domestic violence, having advocated for people who have suffered from domestic violence. This is really true to my heart. So I'm very happy to be a part of this conversation and to learn more. This is such a larger conversation than can truly be encapsulated in just 45 minutes. But I'm joined today by advocates and clergy who were part of the project's advisory team for raising awareness and understanding, a needs assessment of domestic violence in the Jewish community. For the sake of getting the conversation to go quickly as possible, I will briefly introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Shoshannah Frydman, Ph.D. LCSW, is the Executive Director of Shalom Task Force, a national organization with a mission to combat domestic violence and foster safe and healthy relationships. Shoshannah has worked in the field of intimate partner violence with a specialty in the Jewish community for over 20 years. Danielle N. Hartman, President and CEO of Ruth and Norman Rales Jewish Family Services, JFS. JFS is one of the 140 human service agencies across North America and Israel. Many of those agencies, including JFS, have a long-standing domestic abuse program serving their local communities. Danielle has been working in the human service sector for over 11 years. And we have Rabbi David M. Rosenberg, is the co-chair of JWI's Clergy Task Force to End Domestic Abuse in the Jewish Community, of Jewish Women International Coordinator of Jewish Educational Services for JCFS, Chicago. He directs the JCFS NAP Yeshiva and serves as the agency's liaison to the Orthodox Jewish community. And finally, Deborah Rosenberg, JWI's Chief Program Officer, responsible for directing and implementing JWI's programmatic work to end and prevent gender-based violence. Deborah is also the lead researcher and author of the assessment. So let's begin. Deborah, do you mind if I throw it to you first to start? Can you please share the impetus behind this assessment and why now, and what were you hoping to learn?
Thank you, Rain.
Thank you.
Well, this is a unique moment in time, as Lisa mentioned. During the pandemic, domestic violence has become part of the national conversation, partially because as each of us experiences the isolation and the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, it makes each of us more sensitive and more aware of what a survivor might experience every day. And partially because of the greater awareness that the pandemic has created heightened risks for women and families as stay-at-home orders, unemployment, financial hardship, and trauma correlate with an increase of gender-based violence, both here in the United States and globally around the world. So we understood at JWI that this moment in time is a unique opportunity to learn whether the needs of Jewish survivors are being met, and to learn more, to increase our understanding about the needs of the advocates who serve them. Go ahead.
No, please continue.
So we took the leap and we decided to learn about that. And we realized that we're at a crossroads. As the domestic violence field itself is moving towards survivor-centered and community-based responses to violence, the Jewish community can choose to do the same. We know how important community is for survivors, and our community has so much to offer. What we're finding, what we've learned, is not that Jewish survivors' needs are different on the macro level from mainstream survivors' needs. In fact, they mirror them. In the case of Jewish survivors, there are additional layers of communal, cultural, and faith-focused issues. And what we're hoping today is to start the conversation about how to meet all these needs.
Can you tell us how you conducted your research?
Sure.
Thank you.
So we started out by creating this advisory group, which was a cross-section of advocates working in independent agencies and as part of the Jewish Family Services and network of Jewish Human Service agencies. And clergy and researchers. And we developed three surveys, really: a short survey, a longer survey, and then a clergy survey. And we wrote a couple of articles announcing the survey's availability. We partnered with the network of Jewish Human Service agencies to do outreach to the field itself, and also through all of our networks and all of the ways that we communicate regularly with advocates in the field. And we disseminated them. And then we conducted focused conversations with with advocates who had indicated that they were willing to participate in those. And we conducted, we met with 22 advocates, having long conversations with them, with 5 survivors. This is a very we wanted to ensure this was survivor focused, survivor centered needs assessment. And then Rabbi Rosenberg himself met with clergy and spoke with them individually as well. So it's a mix of a quantitative and qualitative study.
Okay. I noticed that you didn't report on the rate of incidence of domestic violence in the Jewish community. Is there a reason for that?
Well, it's not a census, so we're only working with the programs themselves. Many survivors don't turn to these programs for help. They may turn to their individual therapist, to their own lawyers, to non-Jewish, to programs not directly serving the Jewish community. There's many mainstream programs out there. So we have no way of knowing how many Jewish survivors there are. So we're just focused on the people seeking services from these individual programs.
I noticed that so many of the recommendations in the report reference trauma-informed and survivor-centered responses. And for those listening, some of us may not understand what that means in the field. Can you please explain what it means and why it's important?
Of course. So in layman's terms, trauma-informed care means really just being aware that the person, the survivor in this case, is coming from a place of trauma. It views service provision through a lens of trauma and an understanding of how trauma impacts survivors, understanding the trauma triggers and unique vulnerabilities of trauma survivors, and designing services to acknowledge the impact of violence and trauma on people's lives. It's a trauma-informed approach is sensitive and respectful, with supportive intent that consciously avoids re-traumatization. And being survivor-centered means following the lead of the survivor, not being prescriptive and telling the survivor what to do.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Frydman, Shalom Task Force supports all survivors, not just Jewish survivors, but you also have a specialty in working with Jewish community. Please share why this report is significant and what do you think is the impact will actually be?
So thank you so much for including me here today, including me in this whole process. I joked with Deborah last week, it was like giving birth a bit. And, to see it come to fruition is, for those of us in the field, is very exciting. And it's exciting for us in a few different ways. And I reflect on the significance of this report and the impact that I hope that it has on both micro and macro spheres. The experience of domestic violence, and this was touched on already, is very complex. And one of the primary dynamics of it is the feeling of loneliness and isolation. And survivors will often report that they think they're the only one, or if they know it exists out there, but they believe that they're the only one in their community that's experiencing it. And I'm grateful that this is a tool for them on that level, that we know it exists in your community and in your space, and that you're not the only one. And, if we look at here, we had over 400 people register for this call, and we know, and this is not a prevalent study as said, but we know that that means there are people here listening that are also survivors. And we should acknowledge that this is a way of validating their experience in our community, and that we have a responsibility towards them and towards all of us, right? So we could support them in this survivor-centered way, as Deborah mentioned. On a macro level, and I think we're all here for that, is that I hope this really surfaces a dynamic discourse about intimate partner violence in our communities, and that this issue becomes the forefront of our communal agenda. Over the last 2 decades, with my colleagues here and our different colleagues I see on the list here, we've made great strides in how we respond, but there's so much more that we could do. And we've had our anecdotal research, we have our anecdotal stories and vignettes, but having a real piece of research, will help us advocate further and for funding, for programming, and to really create more programming that responds to the needs of the survivors and to our community, so we can create safety. And it's exciting to be here,
Thank you. Thank you for that. So next, I'm going to throw to Danielle. You are the CEO of a Jewish Family Services that includes a domestic violence program. The report speaks specifically to Jewish survivors and Jewish programs. So first, can you explain what it means to be a Jewish DV program and why it's important to specifically address the needs of this group?
Sure, and thank you also for including me. As Deborah mentioned, most of the macro needs are not that much different from mainstream survivor needs, but the Jewish survivors have additional concerns related to communal, cultural, and faith-focused issues. And that's why Jewish agencies are best equipped to provide services to Jewish survivors. Jewish survivors are more inclined to seek services from organizations that are familiar with their culture, their language, and background, highlighting the need for Jewish DV programs around the country. Culturally specific community-based organizations are also better equipped to form essential relationships and engage their communities in the creation and implementation of services relevant to the diverse and unique needs. And as Shoshannah mentioned about the isolation, one of the communal challenges has to do with inclusion and making certain that survivors are included and not shunned by their community, that they continue to be invited to Shabbat meals, that they're welcome at their Jewish community centers and other Jewish communal agencies, and knowing that their children are safe in all Jewish spaces. Another has to do with stigma, and that was also mentioned, that Jewish survivors really value their Jewish community, but often feel stigmatized by it. And sometimes, as a result of an abuser's status in the community, their actions are overlooked or minimized, all at the expense of the abused, which is extremely hurtful to the survivors. And then finally, culturally, the legal aspect. There are legal issues that are unique to the Jewish community, which can be complicated by a husband's ability to withhold the get or the religious divorce decree as a means of control over his spouse, even after a civil divorce has been granted. And we actually have a very well-known case in our community right now of that very situation, Aharon and Deborah Silverberg. Aharon has been denying Deborah a get for over 3 years now, even after our local rabbis have gotten involved and have organized protests outside his home and publicly call on Aaron to out his behavior, demanding that he give his wife a get. And so for all those reasons, that's why we need more Jewish DV programs around the country.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Rosenberg, the report mentions that rabbis or clergy are often the first professional survivors will go to. You're not only the co-chair of JWI's Clergy Task Force to End Domestic Abuse in the Jewish community, you conducted the interviews with the Jewish clergy for the report. Can you share what you're hearing from the clergy and what are the challenges that you are facing and they're facing?
With pleasure, Rain. Thank you. And
Thank you.
It's such an honor to be here as part of the advisory team and to be here. And I see colleagues from the Clergy Task Force here and colleagues also from my local neighborhood of Chicago. Our needs assessment is dedicated in part to the memory of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, whose book, The Shame, Horror, and Silence, strengthened the Jewish communal response to domestic abuse. And Rabbi Twersky wrote, while the aggressor is the immediate perpetrator, the community cannot shirk its culpability if it allows abuse to continue to occur and to continue. So clergy play an essential role as part of the Jewish community's work to address domestic violence. We received assessments from 35 clergy representing 22 cities and had follow-up conversations with 9 clergy. Respondents represent a wide denominational range and a variety of roles. They provide a window into the experience of large groups of clergy nationwide. Responding rabbis and cantors are dedicated to addressing domestic violence in their congregations and organizations and beyond. They recognize DV as an urgent problem, both in the lives of individuals and families and throughout all Jewish communities. 2/3 indicated that victims of DV have approached them for help. 15 told us that they have been the first professional a DV survivor approached. 3 themes emerged. Clergy want to learn how to respond more helpfully to survivors. Clergy seek to work better with local domestic violence providers, and clergy are committed to creating safe spaces for survivors to come forward. A small majority of our respondents have been trained to identify and respond to domestic violence. 59% want more training, including most of those who have already had some training. Clergy seek closer collaborations with advocates and DV organizations for themselves, their congregations and organizations, and their clergy associations. Several expressed that individual outreach by advocates and DV professionals would be the most effective way of initiating collaborative relationships. Clergy need resources for addressing DV, including inserts for synagogue newsletters and scripts and guidance about how to speak with survivors and with perpetrators. Clergy understand that when they engage in regular conversations about DV in sermons, statements, programming, and policy setting, they can create safe spaces for survivors to come forward. One respondent reported, after I did a training for a board of rabbis and encouraged them to speak about domestic violence during their sermons, 2 weeks later, a rabbi called me and told me he never had a case of domestic abuse in the community until the first time I spoke about it from the pulpit.
So Rabbi Rosenberg, the recommendations for clergy seem to point obviously to more training as well as resources to allow clergy to create safe space for congregants who might be surviving violence. So you've been training clergy for years. What happens when a rabbi isn't prepared, and why are we saying training is needed?
Thanks, Rain. As you say, JWI and the JWI Clergy Task Force have been training clergy on DV issues for years. Seminaries, DV programs, and human service agencies around the country are also committed to providing such training. As I shared before, training is an ongoing process. One respondent told us, there is always a need for more training, and even with all the training I have, I often feel as though I'm not 100% prepared. What happens when clergy are not trained, as you ask? They may not be able to recognize signs of domestic violence. They may give unhelpful advice, such as recommending couples therapy. They may mistakenly think that if the perpetrator has expressed remorse, he's done teshuva, the survivor will be safe from further abuse. They may feel powerless against their community's desire to avoid shanda, a sense of scandal or disgrace. They may side with the perpetrator, especially if he is a prominent community member. They may leave survivors vulnerable and re-traumatized. With victim-centered, trauma-informed training, clergy can learn to recognize abuse, to understand its impact on all parties, and to respond appropriately. Clergy will understand that domestic violence is not limited to receiving a black eye. Clergy will understand that a husband's refusal to grant a get, as Danielle mentioned, as a means of asserting power, is a category of domestic abuse. Well-trained clergy will better support a survivor during the 4 stages of change that the assessment describes. Clergy will address domestic violence in sermons and premarital counseling. If a survivor reaches out, a rabbi will first and foremost hear the survivor. Clergy will give helpful referrals to local DV services. A rabbi will work to keep the family safe rather than playing the role of arbiter or mediator. In the stage of long-term healing and independence, clergy will connect the Jewish community in a supportive way with the survivor and her children. Victim-centered, trauma-informed training should be part of the curriculum of all rabbinical and cantorial seminaries. For communities that use a halachic prenuptial agreement, this should be part of the training for clergy. And training, as we've said, should be ongoing throughout the clergy's professional life. Speaking as a rabbi, I'm glad to say that there are useful sources in the Bible and rabbinic tradition that can be incorporated into victim-centered, trauma-informed training.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Deborah, can you speak to the key findings, and can we begin with legal? What are the major gaps in legal services for survivors?
Thank you for asking that. And I want to say that what we learned globally throughout the whole entire needs assessment was that a lot of communities are really struggling with really hyper-local solutions to these issues. And they're national issues. They're something that could really be addressed nationally to help them solve them at a local level. And so what we learned was that the biggest unmet need is around long-term legal representation. And I had actually gone into this thinking that, well, we would figure out a way to have pro bono lawyers, in every community provide all the legal needs. And what we've learned, what I very much learned and what we heard from everybody was that pro bono lawyers can address the short-term legal needs of survivors, such as protection and restraining orders. But even those programs that use pro bono lawyers for these found that pro bono lawyers can only commit to helping survivors for filing that order and to obtain the immediate protective orders. They aren't available necessarily for enforcement of violations or modifications to the protection orders. And another great concern we heard about the use of pro bono lawyers, which we heard from staff attorneys and victim advocates and survivors, was that pro bono attorneys often lack trauma-informed training, which can be very damaging to the survivors they're helping or they're trying to help. So, and what we also heard was that legal services and legal aid are inadequate resources to meet the long-term legal needs survivors face. There's income restrictions around legal services and legal aid. And again, many of them are not equipped to take on these long-term cases. So in many cases, survivors are left to represent themselves, and we want to change that. Legal representation addressing the complex issues a survivor may have, such as child custody, divorce, equitable financial distribution, are only being provided by a few domestic violence programs. These take years to unravel, and they need trauma-informed, survivor-centered lawyers with training in the dynamics of domestic violence to represent the survivors. Lawyers who are on staff at domestic violence programs would value peer support as they struggle with this very difficult work, a clearinghouse of legal resources, mentorship for more experienced lawyers in the community. What every program is asking for, what every program needs, is to have more lawyers on staff who can take on these very complex legal issues that survivors are facing.
Thank you so much, Deborah.
I just wanted to add one thing, which has been mentioned twice, but just to reiterate it, that often legal work in the Jewish community is complicated by the ability of the husband to withhold the get. as a means of control. And so that's something else that has to be addressed by any lawyer taking on these cases.
Thank you so much. Dr. Frydman, please share the major gaps regarding housing that the research revealed.
Sure. So I'm a social worker, and I worked for many, many years in the front lines of domestic violence with clients. And the first thing we do with our clients as survivors is to think about how do you work through safety and stability, and housing and the needs for housing stability is a critical aspect of this work. And there's just inadequate resources available to support survivors in the different stages of these needs. And as said before, I think Danielle mentioned this, but it's the idea of the survivors want to be able to remain in their communities, right? They want to participate in their Jewish communal life. They want to attend the same schools, synagogues, and this poses additional challenges to housing. And then just consider inavailability and the prohibitive costs for many of the communities and the places that the survivors are coming from. So what we've learned from the study is that there's a need for ongoing emergency shelter when it's an appropriate solution, and to understand the limitations of those shelters. That the second finding is that there's significant lack of transitional and affordable permanent housing, and that government subsidized housing is not readily available in Jewish communities. So I would say there's no perfect answer to any of this, not in the report but my suggestion is just to think about this as be as creative and innovative as possible, right? Like we have to think out of the box and how to address this issue. You know, housing is a significant issue. And the recommendations in the report, which really resonate to this, is we should be convening Jewish community leaders, real estate investors, funders to address the lack of transitional long-term housing, create funding mechanisms that recognize how simply expensive it actually is to, create a new home, a stable new home, and also consider the impact of financial abuse as part of the abuse that may have destroyed credit and make it even harder to access, right? Some of those services or secure loans or appropriate safe housing. And then again, to explore partnerships, be creative with Airbnb, Lyft, those type of services to help meet the needs of a transitional long-term housing and moving. So yeah, a stance of creativity and innovation to this really, really challenging problem, but there's significant gaps that we have to focus on to help with stability and safety.
Thank you, Dr. Frydman. Thank you so much. Danielle, please share the main findings regarding gaps, because this is a great, it pairs with what Shauna just said, gaps in economic security.
Right, and some of these will reiterate. So without financial resources, it's impossible to be independent. And it's a challenge for all survivors trying to reestablish themselves. Jewish survivors had an additional challenge due to the high cost of living in many Jewish communities. Under the key findings in the area of income, to reclaim their independence and self-sufficiency, survivors need income that will support themselves and their families. And the next finding was under financial abuse, making it very challenging, if not impossible, for survivors to secure employment, access credit, or obtain housing. And then one critical piece is flexible and sustainable work options. Survivors need jobs that offer work flexibility given their unique challenges. Survivors who may not have worked outside the home or wait to leave an abuser until their children are out of the home have additional challenges finding employment due to lack of work experience or applicable job skills, including computer skills, and sometimes face age discrimination in the workplace. And finally, and this goes back to what Shoshannah was just talking about, the affordability issue. Survivors need increased access to affordable housing, affordable childcare, transportation, and other community services to meet those needs.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Rosenberg, we know that children suffer greatly when they witness domestic violence. And I'm also speaking from experience. Can you please share why building their resiliency is so important and how the community can support this?
Thank you, Rain.
Thank you.
In my work in a therapeutic school, I am familiar with the psychological trauma that adverse childhood experiences can cause in children. Domestic abuse, domestic violence is one of those experiences. A child who witnesses DV may experience anxiety or depression. As they grow, they may encounter challenges in their education, relationships, health, and their success in employment. The Office on Women's Health notes that children who witness violence between parents may also be at greater risk of being violent in their future relationships or of being the victim of sexual abuse. As a provider reported to us, It's heartbreaking when 10 years later, the children who witnessed abuse come back to us as adults experiencing violence in their relationships. Children can be resilient. A child can bounce back from the crisis of domestic abuse without long-term negative consequences. Resilience depends, it's not a simple matter. So resilience depends on several factors, including the child's own emotional state and patterns of response, their relationship with their non-abusive parent, typically their mother, and their school experience. Thankfully, there are protective factors that can increase their resilience. The Jewish community has to play a positive role. Congregations, camps, schools must help children feel a sense of belonging. This is critically important since the life of children can be disrupted by DV and its aftermath. Children may be judged harshly and even ostracized by peers. They may not be able to live, as has been mentioned before, in the same neighborhood or to attend the same school as before. If they relocate, they may not be able to continue to have the same kind of community connections they used to. In addition to needing a safe and stable home free from continued abuse, children need counseling to help them work through their experiences and emotions. They need understanding schools and teachers who can respond to their difficulties with empathy and compassion. And there's work that can be done by youth serving organizations, camps, schools, and youth groups to help them. As Jewish community comes together to support children impacted by DV, our capacity to build children's resilience increases. An advocate told us, our job is to get the kids to be okay. That's where I see the work going and helping. They've been through what they've been through, but now taking that trauma and giving them the tools to be healthy. That's the job. Let us, throughout the Jewish community, give them those tools.
Thank you so much. Deborah, speaking of community, what does the research reveal about the ways the community can support survivors and their families?
Thank you. And I think I'd like to open this up to all our panelists to participate in this question. But what we want to be sure that we're doing is creating supportive communities that are warm and welcoming. You know, I often think about our Jewish community. We meet somebody who played Jewish geography. It's like within 5 minutes of the conversation, it's who do you know? And yet when a survivor feels so alone and so vulnerable and so not supported by the community, it's terrible, because what we pride ourselves on is being this highly networked, highly supportive community. And at those times when people are so most vulnerable, they feel isolated and alone. We want to change that. So we want to ensure that people feel safe where they are, that every Jewish organization has the training to be able to support and protect and ensure the safety of the survivor and their children, and more than the training, that people are aware, like Rabbi Rosenberg was speaking about how to help build the children's resiliency and all the ways that we've been speaking about today, but and also essentially that the advocates themselves are well supported and that funds are there to be able to provide for the critical needs we identified today. But I want to turn it over to Danielle and Shoshannah and Rabbi Rosenberg for.
I was just about to say that.
I mean, I don't know if Rabbi or Shoshannah want to say anything. I just, want to reiterate, but I feel like the answer it's not going to be individual to each community. It's going to be systemic through wider umbrella organizations and partnerships, and looking at things, to Shoshannah's point about being creative and how we solve problems. So not looking at just your community, but how we can collaboratively work nationally to improve some of these things. So that's what I would say.
I feel that, and I think that it's really spoken about, is the more we speak about this, and we all have different roles in bringing the solution, right, and creating this, and we have roles as community members and as professionals, but the more we speak about it, the more possible it is for survivors that are in the situation to envision life that's safer, but still in their community. And that's really important, because we don't want people to feel to have safety, they have to leave their community. That's not what it means to be part of our community. So if we are able to make sure that this is out there, and that the service is out there, and there's a conversation, and the clergy and community members, everybody knows their role and feels empowered in their role, then I believe that, and I've witnessed that, survivors are able to envision their lives in a safer way within community, and that they don't have to make the choice between community and safety.
I think it's really important it's possible to view children of survivors as kind of nebech, it's such a pity that this happened to them, and then they kind of forgotten, their behavior can be difficult, it can be challenging. They're dealing with a lot of stuff, and they can act out in school, and they can act out in a sports team or in a youth group in a way that, or a camp, that can be off-putting to people. And it's possible to view them as being just sort of lost. There's nothing more can be done, and they're victims, they're survivors, but there's nothing that can be done, which is a very unfortunate attitude, and doesn't have to be that way at all. So we need a really, I guess, a community-wide sort of all of community approach to viewing families which have experienced a DV, and not just the survivor herself, but also the children who are part of that experience. That the whole community needs to feel a responsibility, really to counteract the kind of sense that we talked about, the sense of shanda. A community wants to remove the cognitive dissonance and just act as if everything is hunky-dory. So we have to view, we have to see all the families as being our responsibility, including those who've gone through the terrible experience of DV. Yeah.
Thank you. Deborah, I know that this project was so much more than just surveys and focus groups. Can you share what other pieces this project also included?
Thank you. In addition to the survey and the study itself, we were able to provide monthly peer-to-peer support forums. Actually, Shoshannah Frydman and Naomi Tucker, who also served on the advisory, led them every month. And we had advocates come together and just share. And it was a wonderful place for them to kind of just share and to be in the space together with advocates, Jewish advocates from across the country, together in a space and talk about what it was like for them working now during COVID, all the challenges they were facing because of COVID, and all the ways that the survivors that they were serving had difficulty accessing services, and what they were doing to meet those needs. It was tremendously helpful, I think, and it's something that we want to be able to continue. We also provided several trainings for advocates around the financial, some financial resources that are available to survivors during COVID, around how to be good to yourself, around kind of body-centered advocacy, and again, around confidentiality, which is a big issue during COVID when we're providing services. Services are being provided through technology. It's ensure that confidentiality is being maintained, and how do you do that? In addition, we created a database of Jewish domestic violence programs that's going live today on on part of our website. It's Jewish domestic violence. I think it's JWI.org, Jewish-domestic-violence. And on that, there's a whole host of resources for advocates to access. So those are part of the pieces. I want to just add something to what we were talking about before, which was that in the research study itself, when we spoke to survivors, we have examples in there of the way that how people were able to really thrive and move forward and meet and really like take off on their healing journey to a place of independence and safety and real growth, because the community really supported her. And other examples of how when that didn't happen. And I think that if everybody reads that, they can feel the strength of how powerful it can be when the community can step up and support the survivor, and what a difference it can make in somebody's life.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. This has been such an interesting and insightful conversation. We have a few minutes now to take some questions. I know one question that I thought was very fabulous was, we're welcoming to bring hope and community together to change the way women are abused, can get the get, if that made sense. So trying to understand how the get sits within the community, and at what time do you seek out legal help? Any one of our panelists can answer.
I can address the rabbinic issues in traditional communities. So
Yes.
the religious bill of divorce is required in some Jewish communities before, in theory, either a husband or wife can remarry. And it's often used in cases, it's often abused in cases where there's already been a civil divorce, typically by a husband who is withholding again as a way of exercising power. Is someone who in the eyes of the state is no longer his spouse, but in the eyes of the Jewish community, in the eyes of their own Jewish community is. So it's as has been described before, even with tremendous pressure and support from rabbinic leadership, and there are wonderful organizations which deal with this. Aura is referred to in the assessment itself. For example, this is an unsolved problem in the Jewish community, which is just extremely unfortunate. I mentioned the halachic prenuptial agreement, which is a wonderful way to avoid this. And there are parts of the Orthodox community which support that, and there are plenty of parts which don't. So for those that do, it's a wonderful tool and should be used. I think I don't, I'm not an expert in this area. I would wish that get refusal would cease to be occur at all. I think to the extent that we can focus on teaching young Jewish people about healthy relationships, and part of that is to avoid this kind of situation. We can, moving forward, make it less likely that a husband would be a recalcitrant husband would use this method to abuse. Yeah, it's a real hard nut to crack.
Thank you. A great question. Does anyone on the panel have a book or reading recommendations for DV and trauma-focused lens?
I share some books I have found helpful. And if you want to learn more about domestic violence and trauma focus, The Body Keeps a Score is probably, to me, like the reference around trauma by Vanderkalt. I think it's another important book to read around domestic violence is Coercive Control by Lisa Fontes. It really talks about expanding the definition of domestic violence. And a more recent book in the last 2 years, which I think every community member should read, in addition to Rabbi Twersky, which is really a primer for our book, that we've come a long way since his work, but really a primer to our community, is one called No Visible Bruises by Rachel Louise Snyder. It was on the New York Times list. It's for the lay community, but it really, even as someone who has met with hundreds of survivors, brought me to tears, but taught me a lot about the experience of abuse. And I think there was one comment there as I was trying to read through about education. And it is one way of moving forward is having literature that really is accurate and really helps. So those are three that I have all of our interns look at. So yeah, there are many others.
Before the community can be supportive, don't we need to have an effort to educate our communities about DV and what our survivors and families need so they can be advocates and also allies? Who would like to take that?
I mean, I can, definitely. So that's part of the work that we're hoping to be able to do, is to create more public awareness programs, more ways that friends can be helpful, more ways that everybody can be supportive. If a survivor comes forward, if there's somebody that you think might be experiencing abuse, how do you respond to that? What do you say? What do you do? And absolutely, all of our communities would benefit from that. And I think it's something that we're hoping to be able to we've been doing that work, but maybe we'll be doing it in a larger scope now.
Thank you so much. How do you approach cases of child alienation when the perpetrator uses the child to get back at the victim?
Sean, I'm going to let you answer that.
Shut up.
I feel like that's all a training on its own, quite honestly. I mean, there's the clinical perspective, how to work with the family, and then there's the legal perspective of how do you use legal remedies to navigate that, so that children aren't the collateral damage in this. So I don't know if I can really offer more of that now, but I think as we think, some of these questions make me think about like what are our next steps. And I know we have lots of next steps, but real thorough education around GET or real thorough education around some of these clinical issues. I think there's great interest for it and it's important.
That's excellent. Thank you so, so much. So much great information being shared and so many powerful recommendations. If you haven't noticed in the chat, there's a list of different books to address some of the things that we've asked today. And are these examples that everyone gave, are these examples best practices programs targeting adolescents and teens that are beginning to date to sensitize them to the issues of abuse? What are the examples and best practices?
I mean, JWI provides healthy relationships trainings and for teens and young adults on college campuses. Best practices are to get to kids as young as we can. We started with teens, but certainly the more people understand about healthy relationships, whatever context that relationship is, the better everybody will be. And I want to say that our focus, a lot of our focus of our work is engaging men as allies, so that we always want people to understand that we never see sometimes it appears to men that we're attacking them, and not us JWI, but that the world is attacking them in these issues, and that's never our goal. We see men as allies, as part of the solution, as a critical part to a healthy relationship. So that's the work that we do in the places that we get to. And I know that most of the programs themselves do this kind of training and work within their own communities.
I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Danielle Hartman, Rabbi David Rosenberg, Deborah Rosenbloom, Lisa Eisen, Shoshannah Frydman, and Meredith for having me. And thank you all for just being here, and for all our attendees that joined us today.
Thank you.
Meredith?
Thank you so much. Rain, you beat me to it. I was going to thank our incredible panel and you for sharing the key findings from this study. Just so everyone listening knows, you will get a link to the full report, and the full report does go into more detail and provides data. So I encourage you this afternoon, when you get that email, download and read the report. As Deborah briefly mentioned, the link will take you to a page where we are now hosting the most up-to-date list of local Jewish domestic violence programs throughout the country, so that those experiencing abuse can access help. We will continue to maintain this list. And for those of you on the call who work with the program, let us know if we're missing you or if anything needs to be updated. You know, for JWI, this assessment is the beginning. Back in 2003, 2004, we conducted a similar assessment. And from that study, we launched the National Alliance to End Domestic Abuse, which is our high-level training series for those in the field, the Clergy Task Force to End Domestic Abuse in the Jewish Community, and the Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. All three of these initiatives continue to move the needle today. So some 18 years later, we could not begin to think of what is needed now without taking this assessment of the field. And now that we understand the needs, we can begin to develop the appropriate responses to fill the gaps. So you'll see in the report our initial recommendations for response, some of which has been discussed briefly today. They include creating a clearinghouse of needed legal documents to support staff attorneys of domestic violence programs, building a national landscape of safe and affordable housing so that survivors and their families can remain in their Jewish communities, offering skills-based job training, entrepreneurial training, and financial literacy training to help survivors of financial abuse work towards sustained safety and independence, expanding the peer support forums we launched in connection with this resource to not only help share best practices, but to support the well-being of the advocates, staff, and attorneys who work at the agencies and programs, and raising awareness in the community so that survivors are embraced and not shunned, and that their children are given tools to be resilient. JWI will also be expanding our federal efforts to advocate for legislation that supports survivors and works to end violence, and continue to do this work in community with the 40 faith-based organizations who comprise our Interfaith Coalition. In fact, we have a Senate hearing on May 5th to share the findings from this assessment as part of our efforts to expand and reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. Essentially, what we've learned is that there are national systemic needs that our local organizations do not have the bandwidth to make happen, but JWI can and will, offering trainings, connecting programs to collaborate, giving them the opportunity to showcase their innovation so that a program in San Francisco can learn about and have access to training being offered in Philadelphia. And in 2 years, gathering once again for an international conference on domestic violence. Over the next 2 weeks, we're hosting conversations with experts, thought leaders, and stakeholders to get feedback on these ideas, to learn what's feasible, what we're not considering, what more we could consider. And then we're going to refine our ideas based on these conversations and begin to build. And I hope that any of you on this call who might be interested in being part of that building, either as a partner or a funder, that you will reach out to me. You know, in a year when so many have lived in sadness and isolation, who have lived with fear and abuse, in a year where so many have died, not just because of the virus, but because of violence, for those of us who have had the great privilege to have lived in safety and in love, we've gained empathy and understanding. A window has opened. A conversation has begun. But all too soon, life will return to a new normal, and people will once again close their eyes and look away, for that is our nature. So let's not waste this moment of awareness and care. We have a real opportunity now to make a difference, to move the needle and change how our survivors and those who serve them are supported, to make sure they have what they need to ensure lives of safety for themselves and their children. But we can't do it without you. On behalf of JWI and the Needs Assessment Team, I thank you for caring about this research, and I look forward to partnering with you in the future. I wish you health and safety. Thank you.